A pleasure to meet all at last, and welcome once again to HJN Season 4, or HJN Super Graphix, where I feel like that in terms of talking about whole individual series, I have covered such series already, including a number of different franchises. The Train Sim World series, which spanned across 5 different games so far, was certainly something worth talking about, especially when in regards to all of the crazy marketing tactics that Dovetail Games wanted to put together for us players. And then of course that outrageous rebuy thing that they just put up with this upgrades. But I feel like that by now it's time for us to move on. We might as well get talking about a certain series that had been put together years after the Supermassive Games' big success in 2015 with Until Dawn. Now, I have talked a lot about that game already, so I don't necessarily need to go into detail on that much longer. But, of course, a 4-year time gap would pass where developer Supermassive Games would work together with publisher Bandai Namco to release an all-new horror series, the Dark Pictures series. Yeah, and you probably know by now that I've already had a bit of history with the franchise itself. A series that has been around for 5 going on 6 long years now, and wouldn't you know, we finally have a supposed release for Directive 8020. And I have been waiting nearly 3 years for Directive 8020 to finally come around. Especially when they basically sent us the original teaser trailer at the end of The Devil in Me, which came out in 2022. And since then, there hasn't been a lot about it. Some delays, some pushbacks, and a number of other problems have taken place. But I'm more than happy now that we finally have a confirmation and a slated release coming at some point later this year, where the Dark Pictures Directive 8020 is finally going to become a reality. A horror game in space? Not exactly my first time out there. Remember the Alien series? Predator Hunting Grounds? I mean, I don't want to get off topic too much here. So, what we're going to do is we're actually going to spend a few episodes talking about the Dark Pictures games entirely. For 2585, we're going to get started with no better place than Dark Pictures' Man of Medan. The first of its kind, August 2019, of its original release, at least in the US. And I will say that having played all 4 of the games throughout 2022, a marathon through them pretty much, I can confirm that it's a fantastic series. It basically extends further out to the idea of multilinear direction, which of course is the type of gameplay that's officially fixated on the likes of branching paths and choice making throughout the whole length of each game that you play. And Until Dawn, at the time of its release in late 2015, was in fact a huge success. And while this was definitely not the first case of such a game in which that different paths could be made, different choices could be made, this kind of trope has been a big peace of mind when it came to gaming development, as well as through player choice. And I will say that probably the biggest advantage that this sort of gameplay has is replay value. Yeah, you could go back to this game many times as you feel, and you could probably never get bored. There's a number of different ways that you can play this stuff, but I will say that the best out of all the games that serve this sort of functionality is Detroit Become Human, which I've also talked a lot about in the original HJN Graphix. But of course, having played through all 4 of the Dark Pictures games, we might as well go on ahead and get started with Man of Medan here, and work our way to The Devil in Me, knowing that Directive 8020 is upon us, finally. Anyways though, Man of Medan does take us on a bit of a seafarer type of adventure, in which that it takes us to some sort of ancient shipwreck. Moreover, Man of Medan originally starts off post-World War II with a certain warship A warship that likely could have been involved in World War II, Pearl Harbor, or possibly elsewhere. But it's more likely that Manchuria, which of course was a Northeast Asian territory, which encompassed a good amount of present-day China, as well as some select parts of Russia. It seemed to be that after World War II, a number of things were going on in Asia or the States. But there were, in fact, apparently, a number of crew members that had become ghostly apparitions. And this was mostly due to the fact that this ship had been overrun in the past. How it happened, why it happened, it was unexplained at the time. But when you think about it, American soldiers were trying to have a good time, but all they got were some not so good days. And so, this is basically where we are eventually brought over to the present day, likely in 2019, as the game's release took place at that time, in which that there was a group of 5 people. These 5 people are in fact as much of seafarers as anyone who had been out there in the ocean in World War II, whether it be Asia or whatnot. There's 2 brothers known as Alex and Brad. And I should probably mention that there's actually 2 different actors who portray them. One, of course, portrays them in the physical range, typically as a means of motion capture animation. A thing that has become pretty common in video games. I mean, have you played Batman Arkham, Uncharted, Tomb Raider, or some other games? There's a good amount of games nowadays, especially the big ones, that have had the usage of motion capture animation in order to create flawless animating characters, as well as some of the most realistic feels and action. Then of course there's 3 other members around there. There's Alex's girlfriend Julia, Conrad, whom is her brother, as well as the skipper, Fliss. All 5 of them are in fact portrayed by at least one person. But Conrad is the only guy out there whom has not only been played by the likes of Shawn Ashmore, but also voiced by Shawn Ashmore. So, I guess you could say he doubled down on his performance there. And I hope they gave him twice as big of a paycheck. Even though that wouldn't seem very fair to the others. In any case though, Ashmore does a phenomenal job. And we know that Conrad is technically the lead role in this instance. Despite the fact that there are 5 protagonists, Conrad is truly the one up front, while everybody else is close behind. But however, let's just say that this little trip on the sea doesn't turn out so well. There's basically a group of modern day pirates. Yeah, if you're wondering, modern piracy is real. And this can typically happen in various select parts of the world, whether it be Africa or Asia. Even some parts of South America are known to have pirates that can board certain ships and raid them of their supplies or even kidnap the crew members. Sometimes even marauding them, as in death. Yeah, it just sort of harkens back to the days when Vikings used to rule the seas. But when you think about it though, as crazy as this plot twist sounds, it's not necessarily out of the ordinary. But modern day piracy, in the instance of Americanized ships, doesn't necessarily happen all too often. Anyways though, these pirates are actually on the lookout for some sort of thing known as gold. But it's not just any gold, apparently. This kind of gold takes place in some sort of ghost ship. Yeah, wouldn't you know? Apparently this ghost ship probably had something to do with that old ship that we saw in the flashback scene post-World War II. But when you get down to it, the idea of certain treasure being aboard that ship and the ship itself being not so accessible, this does tend to boil down to the fact that whatever's going on up there likely is going to make whatever's going on down there even more intense. The pirates and the 5-person crew are eventually escorted to the ship, in which that they are all captured and locked away in the room. However, my choices actually did allow one of the characters to get out of there alive with his life. He stole one of the boats. Yeah, and wouldn't you know that making your way up to the surface from scuba diving, you of course had to do something known as decompression. Yeah, because what happens is that when you dive down further, there's a little thing called the bends. That's basically where bubbles fill up in your body, especially your blood vessels. And what happens is that if you go up too quickly, decompression doesn't quite take place properly, and this can cause the bubbles to pop in your system. Pain would be agonizing. And the same thing, believe it or not, can happen if you're way up in the air. In fact, there's even that little phenomenon where if you go deep sea diving, it's best to not take off on a flight right afterwards. You're going to need some time to readjust to the pressure that's above water, especially if it's solid land. So, yeah, I feel like I'm getting off topic at this point here, but the choices I make from then on out do start to get even more interesting, especially when the story does, in fact, give us a variety of different obstacles. Because it's not just the pirates we have to deal with, but eventually, remember when I mentioned that there are supposed ghost apparitions taking place? Well, the same thing would actually happen here. And my gosh, the horror factor in this at least does intensify in such a unique way. And what it boils down to is that it's not just about any escape operation that they're trying to do, but the remaining survivors that I assembled here go into the radio room of the ship in order to request evac as soon as possible. Because after all, the boat that they came in, unfortunately, is out of commission. Yeah. They just had no other way to get back. So, of course, there's a number of things that take place here. This Manchurian gold apparently was some sort of bioweapon. Yeah, as it turns out, this was made as an induction of hallucinogenic reactions on whatever victims that this weapon was used. So, the gold was basically the opposite of what these pirates were looking for. I mean, that's just strange. Moreover, that's probably the finer reason why it was better left alone than try to be gathered around by some sort of pirate group. Let alone the fact that there's a small crew aboard as well. Hostages, basically. But hey, even this guy known as Olsen, he didn't really stand much of a chance against such an onslaught like this. And we're quite thankful that the decisions I managed to make here, from evading the ghosts to getting out of the pirates' clutches, it eventually did all lead to a few survivors getting out of there. While some decisions did unfortunately lead me to not have such a good turnout for some of the people involved. Yeah, including some of my own survivors. They've either gotten hurt or even killed. But hey, at least I can say that I was able to get out of there with some people intact. Then of course there was that one other guy whom got away on the boat, but then he got over to the ship and found nobody there. I guess you could say I accidentally led him into a trap, leaving him possibly for dead. One last thing that I could mention here, or certainly will be worth mentioning, is that there was a curator. Yeah, a certain rock song accompanies this curator's entry into the room, of which that he discusses in a fourth wall break perspective. Quite literally, he looks at the camera, at the player involved. In other words, this curator, played by Pip Torrens, is talking to me, specifically. Or basically anybody who is playing the game entirely, basically. He's looking at the player. But the whole point of that was, if you remember Until Dawn, you might know about a certain Peter Stormare character whom does a similar thing. He plays a psychologist. but Pip Torrens as a curator, like at a museum, if you will. But the curator, in the same way that Stormare's character in Until Dawn does in fact discuss details of this adventure as it unfolded. All the facts that have been discovered and all of the different things that have been collected, and most importantly, all the decisions that you've made. This is a thing that goes through all of the games so far, and I'm sure that with the upcoming Directive 8020, it won't be any different. If Pip Torrens is still around, surely he'll be back for being the curator, just like how he was in the whole series. I'm not kidding. Man of Medan, Little Hope, House of Ashes, Devil in Me, as well as the VR game known as Switchback. This is a recurring character that has become more than just a piece of essential mind. But the thing is, all of these games, believe it or not, are actually certain stories that are deemed incomplete. And the curator actually explains to us that it's up to us to finish the story and get it made as a piece of history in his museum. So, that is impressive. I mean, a video game in which that you make your own story and give it to a curator to put up in a museum? That is brilliant, I tell you that much. It's probably not like Until Dawn, in which that this recurring psychologist character just goes around and explaining to us about what we've done with our life and what we've done with all the characters involved. But I will say, it's an incredible idea. The whole idea of a game like this is to make our own story and forge our own path from start to finish. How many survivors we bring in, how many decisions we make, whether good or bad, and how many relationships do we establish within. In fact, all of the characters do have their own stats regarding their emotion, regarding their relationship status, regarding a number of things. Just like what happens in Until Dawn. So I can really get the gist that Dark Pictures was more than just some inspiration from Until Dawn. In fact, it seems to recycle a lot of elements. I mean, we have quick time events. We got points where the controller needs to be held steady. We got points where we need to remain quiet. We got points where we need to keep the heart rate situation under control as a means of not attracting attention. These are all just the unique points of Until Dawn in which that it helped to build up tension and even allow for us players to really ensure that we make such a positive choice here. Otherwise, the consequences could prove to be fatal. But at the end of the day, Man of Medan was a unique trip through the seas, through the ghost ship, and of course, fighting against pirates and finding a way out. I won't say more about this whole thing, but having only played through it once, I can't quite guarantee that a whole lot of information can be brought out here. I will say that the story is unique. The idea of modern piracy becoming a primary factor that allows all of our characters to be brought into the main hub where events truly begin to unfold, that really does allow for us players to get a good chance not only to look at something that's still around today, but to also understand there's a reason why certain treasure must never be touched, let alone collected by pirates. In any case, though, being the first of its kind, well, not exactly the first, as Supermassive already got big with Until Dawn, but through the assistance of Bandai Namco, they were able to crank out a number of games in rapid succession. And with each one, they have gotten themselves a good amount of success, financially and critically. Man of Medan, by my count, probably doesn't stand as the best title in the series so far, but it gets pretty close. I will say that score-wise, it's probably only a 7.4 out of 10.1. But that's mostly because, compared to the other games, they sure do know how to offer a lot more. But tomorrow, we're going to talk about the sequel that came out a year later, known as Little Hope. And I probably ought to mention, after you beat the games, in that one last speech from the curator, there was of course the teaser trailer, which showcased us every future installment. Men of Medan teased Little Hope. Little Hope teased House of Ashes. House of Ashes teased The Devil in Me. And of course, The Devil in Me had teased Directive 8020. Like I said, we'll get to that point where when it does come out, it'll be quite an event for us Dark Pictures fans. So, I'll be back tomorrow to talk about Little Hope. And if you want to see more, go down to my channel to make sure that you like, subscribe, comment, follow me wherever you can find me, and stay on the Hollywood side.